Hello, welcome to the first lecture in Soccer 3220, Youth Culture and Risk. So I'm Steve Threadgold. I'll be taking you through the whole course. In the first half of the course, I'll be doing the lectures in normally 2 or 3 parts, and in the second half of the course, the lectures will mostly be taken up by discussions that I have with other researchers. So remember from the instruction video the way that I suggest that you should do the kind of lectures and readings. I think you should read the PowerPoint slides first and then listen to the lecture rather than kind of sitting there watching it, which is kind of, in some ways not going to be heaps entertaining in the sense that I'll be using the PowerPoints as a guide. I won't be kind of going through them methodically. So I reckon you're better off listening to the lectures more like a podcast rather than sitting there at your computer and watching them. And that means that you can then go to the readings, which are normally a little bit more complex, and you'll have some of the kind of background knowledge to understand those readings better. The quizzes in the course are based upon mostly on the lecture notes and also on the readings, so I think that will also keep you in kind of the best method to being able to do well in those quizzes. So today I'm going to take you through Introduction to Youth Studies in quite generally, as a way of setting up the content for the rest of the course. So I'll be doing that in a couple of parts. I'm doing an introduction to youth studies generally, then talking about the specific kind of traditional areas of youth studies, which is about youth transitions and youth cultures, and then I'll be briefly touching upon how in the last kind of decade there's been an effort to try and bridge the gap between those two things. And the third part will discuss aspects that connect to youth studies about what it means to be an adult, and talk a little bit about Peter Kelly's important work that thinks about how young people are constantly under surveillance. They're an artefact of expertise, and also as a way of kind of being self-critical about what youth studies does itself. So, in terms of what the very idea of youth is, we can see it in official government statistics. It's, if you're on youth allowance or whatever that's called these days, it's normally between 50 and 25. The United Nations has it somewhere between 15 and 28. So different institutions will have a different age range. And the age ranges, I suppose, began with a kind of idea that it was this liminal period of transition from being a child on one hand and an adult on the other. And there's that kind of period where you go through this notion of growing up, of becoming more responsible, more independent, and these kind of things. So there's kind of physical ways of thinking about how you become an adult, but there's also kind of social and cultural ways. And so this period of youth is seen as a way of when those markers of adulthood were kind of ticked off on the way to becoming what's classified as an adult. Leaving the family home and getting your own place to live, finishing education and getting a full-time job, and finding a life partner and setting up your own family and kind of having kids and that kind of thing. So you can see there, I suppose, that the age itself isn't as important today, because the problem is much of youth studies has been troubled by its own findings, in the sense that many of those markers of adulthood are now happening later in life. They're not really ticked off by the time you're in your early 20s. So we'll discuss that a little bit more about the concept of adulthood later on. The way that we think about youth in youth studies is more kind of social and cultural construction. It's a concept. Young people are figures of various kind of social features. So it's a concept, an image, a way of life. You can see that youth is particularly a kind of very popular concept to be used to try and sell us stuff. We all kind of apparently want to stay as young as we can for as long as we can, and we'll buy as many products as we can to do that. And so youth studies is a way of thinking about what this kind of socially constructed concept of youth means, beyond this kind of, specific age bracket. So the way we'll be thinking about it in many ways follows Bourdieu's work about how he argues that youth is just a word, but we'll be using this word a lot throughout the course in kind of different contexts. So Bourdieu, for instance, kind of talked about how the division between young and old is a key power division in societies, and that kind of division is used to keep young people in their place and in a way to try and teach them to be this kind of responsible, productive citizen or whatever. The problem with that kind of concept of youth being applied very generally there, is that there's so many different people, so many different young people from different backgrounds and different circumstances, that to label them all under that one concept, that one term, youth, is a kind of abuse of language, according to Bourdieu. It's a form of what he calls symbolic violence, and we'll go into some of Bourdieu's concepts in some more detail later in the course. So this idea of youth is just a word, it's a way of describing this liminal period, but the sociological perspective here will point out that there's many different distinctions and divisions and inequalities and opportunities like that going on within that period. So to talk about young people as just one amorphous group can be very problematic at times. That said, it's inevitable in something like youth studies that we are going to do that as well. So there's also kind of generational analyses of young people, and again there's debates about how much generations are useful ways of thinking about different age groups, and how maybe there's more differences within generations than between them sometimes. But we'll be kind of moving back and forth between these different concepts of youth throughout, and we'll be looking at different theories to understand that. So in that sense, we'll be abusing language in that Bourdieusian sense in some ways. But when we talk about youth as a more general concept, I suppose, we'll be talking about the ways that they kind of tend to be an object of kind of social control, or an artifact of expertise, as Peter Kelly talks about. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in part 3. So in youth studies broadly, there's been 2 traditional areas of research. And they haven't always been completely separate. There's always been crossovers between them, which has been really important. Those kind of research projects themselves have been particularly prominent. But quite generally, because doing research needs to be quite specific, and you need to focus on particular issues, it's been a kind of quite productive way to have people focusing on the one hand on youth transitions and on the other on youth cultures. Now, youth transitions is focused on those, I suppose, markers of adulthood that I was talking about earlier on, and, understanding the different ways that people approach those things. So this is research about, work and education, about different opportunities, about deviance in some ways, and the ways that people take up different subject positions, about the family, about relationships. So youth transitions has looked at particularly the transition from school to education, from living in the family home to having your own independent place, and in terms of developing relationships. Youth cultures have tended to look at more kind of leisure practice and cultural practices and artistic stuff and creative things. Youth subcultures have been a particular strong object of study, and throughout the late 60s, early 70s, this is where the kind of youth culture studies started to be developed, particularly what's become known as the Birmingham School. And the understanding of consumption, of creativity, have been a really important area of understanding youth. We'll be looking at that stuff a lot throughout the course, and particularly when we look at some of my own research. As I said, more recently it has been an attempt to bridge the gaps between these 2 things, and I'll talk about that a little bit more detail in part 2.